Okay, folks, now we're on to food safety. So I want to premise this by stating that, first of all, why is food safety so important? Because we have to take into consideration there are a lot of diseases associated with our food, and this could be due to natural ignorance that people just don't know how to manage people in terms of refrigeration or properly cooking things to the correct internal temperature or sterilizing their equipment, their handling of food with unwashed hands. Also, things to take into consideration is unsanitary water. This would be, other parts, developing nations in the world, or if you're out in the woods, the living conditions, the transference of sewage. In China, they utilize human feces as fertilizer. All of these can influence our safety with foods. Now, how are we ever really able to tie food safety to human health? Well, actually, we want to give that credit to go back, especially to John Snow, who was a medical scientist in the 1800s. And in 1854, he was tracking the incidences of cholera in London, trying to figure out what in the heck was going on. And he created a plot map to identify where these outbreaks were, because people couldn't figure out why was cholera so prevalent during this time period. And he was able to identify the areas that had the greatest outbreaks were centric to a water pump. He was later able to figure out that it wasn't the water pump itself that was the cause of sickness. It was actually the location in the Thames River that the water was being pumped from. That particular location that the water came in was where sewage was coming out into the into the river. So people were literally pumping their own raw sewage back in and using it to clean food and cook with. Yeah, it's a big old ew. So John Snow is just really special in the world of epidemiology. Other people are to take into consideration Robert Koch in 1883 with his postulates for microbiology and bacteria. Big players in history. Typhoid Mary, a woman who was an asymptomatic carrier of typhus, who was, this was in the early 1900s, was preparing foods for people. And her coming in contact with them, especially she was famous for making raw peaches and ice cream. When she would slice the peaches with her raw hands, she would transfer, this is kind of gross, but she would transfer the typhus to the food, and the people who would be eating these peaches would get sick. In the time that she was a private a cook for families, 23 people had gotten sick with typhus, and in particular, one child had died. Now, not knowing she was an asymptomatic carrier, Typhoid Mary ended up moving on and working in different institutions, at hotels, restaurants, and was last working at a hospital kitchen where she sickened 25 people and 2 of those people died. Oops. So the conundrum is that which we cannot see can be the most lethal for us. All right, so one of the most powerful things we have are our government agencies, and they do help us, protect us, but there's a lot of politics involved with this also, and we have to kind of really make a decision at some point. Where does that power begin and where should it stop? Folks, there's a link here for a really great video on PBS. It's, maybe a minute and a half long. But I would please appreciate you go to your original lecture and click on this, because it's a really great commentary about the conversation of where does government control begin and end. All right, really the most powerful agency in protecting us regarding foods is going to be the FDA, the Food and Drug Agency. And their job is to oversee things like microbial foodborne illness, meaning that when we have things in our foods, outbreaks especially, the communication by the FDA to the public to let us know what's happening is really vital so that foods can be pulled off of shelves and destroyed, reducing the impact on human health. They are also responsible for overseeing natural toxins that exist in food. The residues in foods, meaning that would include then your environmental contaminants, could be things like PCBs, it could be pesticides, once they're on our food as residue, and animal drugs, things like recombinant bovine growth hormone, RBGH, or hormones used in animals, recombinant bovine growth steroids, or the utilization of antibacterial agents to reduce the likelihood of infection spreading among animals. The FDA is responsible for nutrients in foods and the responsibility of people when they say that an ingredient is in the food, it is represented. This also goes hand in hand with our nutrition labels and the ingredients that are listed. Any intentional food additives. So obviously if you pull the carrot out of the dirt and there's some dirt on it, that's not an intentional food additive. But if you are creating a recipe and adding a dough conditioner or artificial dyes, then this falls under the auspices of the FDA. The FDA is officially also responsible for genetically modified foods, though on a national standard, we do not mandate testing, and we do not mandate communicating with the public that foods are genetically modified. There are other agencies that are involved with our health and food safety. First of all, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. They monitor the prevalence of infections, the trends that happen in our nation, the causes and interventions. They provide DNA tracking even of foodborne pathogens. Pretty darn cool. We'll watch a quick video on that. The EPA's responsibility is the oversight of water and pesticides as a regulatory commission for the whole United States. But if you recall, like Flint, Michigan, the responsibility of water locally is under the municipalities. CORE is an organization actually that falls under the FDA that has some similar roles to CDC in trying to prevent and minimize outbreaks. It's a little bit of duplication, folks, in Washington, D.C. there. The USDA is responsible for our meat, poultry, and eggs for foods that cross state lines. They are actually involved in nutrition research. A lot of their research is with Tufts University in Massachusetts. The education of people, health practitioners, think of choosemyplate.gov. And school food standards. The USDA is responsible for establishing those standards and communicating them. The World Health Organization on a global scenario is responsible for food additives, safety, foodborne illnesses, GMOs, pesticides, drinking water. So they are actually one comprehensive agency, whereas in the United States we have little subgroups. This is because we tend to be a little government heavy. The World Health Organization, folks, does tend to take a little more conservative approach regarding some of these items. And then lastly, the EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority. They, folks, are absolutely a fantastic resource. This is why I provided the link for you, that if you have concerns about food additives, I strongly encourage you to research them on their website because they tend to default to a more conservative side, and they will communicate with you very clearly why certain food additives, for example, artificial dyes, are banned in Europe because of their ties as cancer-causing agents. Now, in the work environment and hopefully in the home environment also, there is something called a HACCP that has been developed. That's a Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And what it is a flow chart that enables us to identify where in the preparation of food foodborne pathogens have the ability to develop and grow so that they impact human health. And in the example I have here is that if you were to have a pot roast and it's frozen, then the freezing of it would need to be under refrigeration, not out on the counter, because if it were out on the counter, as the frozen food starts to defrost, any bacteria that was on that meat would then have the ability to come back to life and start reproducing exponentially. On the other hand, if the pot roast were delivered, it would have to be delivered at a specific temperature, refrigerated, held there. After being cooked, would have to be cooled in a bath to accelerate the cooling evenly before either being stored in the refrigeration or frozen, depending on what stage it's in. So I think an easier example for you is going to be that when I was in the hospital, I was responsible for overseeing milk delivery. Really exciting, right? And what I basically had to do is that when milk was delivered by the delivery truck, I had to check the temperature of the truck to make sure that they were conforming to requirements for temperature. And then I would have to pull out a case of milk from the truck, open it up, and pull out one random milk and plunge a thermometer into it. And that temperature had to meet the internal temperature mandated for milk. Then the milk had to promptly be documented as to how much I received, what temperature it was stored at, and it would be delivered directly into our refrigeration units. It would be, we follow the premise always, whether home or in commercial environments, etc., of FIFO, first in, first out. So the new milk coming in would have to be placed at the back of the shelf and the more recent milk pulled to the front of the milk. And then once the milk is all in the refrigeration, twice a day, I would have to walk the kitchen and check the temperature of every single refrigerator and freezer, documenting the temperature. This way we would see any possible anomalies in temperature. When it's time to serve milk to patients, we would have the tray line set up, identify what it is the patients have ordered, what we're preparing for them, and we would only bring the milk out towards the end of preparation for the tray line. The milk would be placed on the tray, and then if the whole tray is refrigerated, it will go into a transferable refrigeration unit on wheels that we would wheel up to the floor of the hospital. It would either slide into a refrigeration unit up there, or it would be self-contained in its refrigeration and then distributed to each patient promptly. Every single step that was taken was an opportunity for bacteria to start growing if the temperature had not been maintained. So those steps were all considered the critical control points of the potential of pathogen development and multiplication. Now, when there is an outbreak, folks, there are things that are taken into consideration that we have to identify right away. First of all, who is being impacted? Because people who are elderly, immune compromised, or young children have the weakest immune systems. This could be a low-grade outbreak, meaning only targeting small population groups, or it could be pervasive, impacting people of all ages. This helps us understand how powerful the bacterial exposure is. We also need to take into consideration things like the signs and the symptoms of the outbreak. Vomiting, diarrhea, upset stomach, fever. Later in this lecture, we'll come across a page that breaks all these down for you as a great reference for you. We also need to know the date. And then that's kind of hard because people oftentimes assume, oh, it's what I ate right now is what's making me sick, but it could take days before it manifests in the human body and expresses itself. So we acknowledge this, and what we need to do is at the very least gather the dates as to when the onset of symptoms and signs began. We have to consider the location or region of the outbreak, because then we have to work backwards, utilizing hopefully barcodes on the products to establish the point of sale, the distributor of that food, and who the original supplier was. This is when we're able to then issue a mass recall through businesses and even on the news to get people, for example, with lettuce to toss it, or cheese, depending on what kind of outbreak it is. Now, what kind of foodborne illnesses are there? There are 6 types in particular, folks, prevalent in our society. First of all, viral. Hepatitis would come from a person who does not effectively wash their hands when performing bathroom duties and then handling food. Norovirus, boy, that one is pretty virulent. For this reason, folks, whenever we handle food, we want to practice either 1, really good hand cleaning, 2, wearing gloves, 3, not eating food around the preparation of food where we could spray saliva, 4, if we're sick, not be involved in food preparation, because again, the transference of possible things like virus or bacteria. Oh my goodness. There's a lot to take into consideration. You also have to think about people who have rings or wear watches with food prep, or have long fingernails, or have acrylics on their fingernails. These are all opportunities to trap bacteria that can fester in those spaces and then cross-contaminate other foods. In the case of norovirus, this one has actually come up more frequently in recent years, where we had outbreaks on cruise ships. And the conundrum with norovirus is it takes a fomite, very similar to the COVID-19 virus. That it takes one person to be sick with norovirus. They're sniffling, they don't know they're sick yet, they wipe their nose, they're walking down the grand stairway of the cruise ship, and after wiping their nose, they put their hand down on the railing as they walk the length of the staircase. The next person comes along and doesn't notice anything. They briefly touch this railing and they have the potential of picking up the virus. They then proceed to do things like stick their finger in their eyes to rub their eyes, or to children to clean their noses, custom cleaning. And folks, those are all opportunities where the virus now has direct access to membranes in the body, which is then direct access to our blood. Hence, please always be present to the fact we never stick our fingers in our eyes without effectively washing them first. We never stick our fingers into our noses, or anyone else's for that matter, without effectively washing our hands first. Because it's not just us, it's the moment you touch your cell phone, you touch a doorknob, you touch a chair, a table, a napkin dispenser. It doesn't matter, folks. Bacteria and virus are everywhere. That's a part of life. It's perfectly natural and normal. But that small percentage that are dangerous can be lethal for some people. All right, bacteria that are very popular, unfortunately, in our society. Salmonella, right? What do we relate that to? Chicken and eggs. Folks, just so you understand, eggs in America, eggs naturally have kind of like a mineral type coating on the outside of the egg because the shell is porous, and this is what helps protect it and seal it. But because of the close proximity that chickens are held in the United States versus being allowed to be out at pasture and roam, they tend to develop salmonella and transfer it from chicken to egg very easily. For this reason, the United States washes their eggs. All right, well, I appreciate the fact that they're washing the eggs to eliminate the likelihood of salmonella, but once they do that, they eliminate the protective coating on the eggs, which means now the eggshell is porous. So if that egg then it comes in contact again with something that has any type of bacteria, it will transfer into the egg. And what is an egg rich in? Protein. And the protein includes cells that have DNA that things like bacteria feeds off of and virus love to invade. Another type of bacteria common is Listeria. Listeria, if you recall, is the one that is incredibly dangerous for pregnant women because it could result in the death of the fetus. Listeria is, but often found with foods like the raw cheeses and dairy in general. But folks, it's not to say that it's limited to these foods. Sometimes we have Listeria outbreaks on roasted nuts. It was just a cross-contamination that spread in the processing of those nuts. E. coli is found in our lower intestinal tract in the colon, and that's absolutely natural for animals. But the thing is, it belongs there. It does not belong anywhere else. So how are we accessing E. coli in our diet as a foodborne pathogen? Well, it's basically pretty much coming from feces, and there's a few possible routes. One is some years ago we had an outbreak of E. coli associated with washed spinach that came from California, and what that was is in the spinach fields a feral pig was running through the fields. All right, how cute, oink oink. But the problem was the pig was depositing some friends in the field, aka poop. And when they would flood the fields to water the spinach, it would disseminate his feces onto the different spinach. When they then harvested the spinach and put it in these giant vats of water to wash it, it further disseminated the feces, spreading the E. coli out onto the spinach. The spinach was then bagged up and shipped off to different restaurants, held at a cold temperature, which suspends the E. coli. When people take the spinach out and they use it as a raw salad and they leave it out on the counter or their salad sits at room temperature for a while, the E. coli becomes active again. People ingest it. The more they ingest, the longer it's sat out, the greater the colonies, the more likely they are to get sick. E. coli is a nasty one because when we are overexposed to E. coli, it has the ability, when it passes through the body, to actually induce organ failure. So not cool. The ugliest cases of E. coli outbreaks are really associated with beef, ground beef. And that's because when they harvest cows and they have they're going to carve them, they'll have the carcass hanging, and as they cut, if the person accidentally punctures the intestines, it will spray the contents onto other carcasses hanging nearby. Included in that will be E. coli. So when they carve the steaks, steaks are not as big a concern because as long as you cook it, you sear it on the outside, it will kill all bacteria. Bacteria does not naturally migrate into solid surfaces. It's on the into the solid interior, it remains on the surface. But when you take those leftover chunks of meat and you throw them in the grinder, you're now increasing the surface area for the E. coli to feed off of. When you mix a variety of different meats together, you're providing even more food source for the E. coli. You package it up, you distribute it. When people cook their hamburgers, if they do not cook it all the way through, the E. coli will stay alive inside the hamburger because all that is a bunch of surface area pressed together. And then they receive exposure to the bacteria. Many years ago, we had an outbreak with Jack in the Box where it was up and down the West Coast. People were exposed to E. coli through the hamburgers. And unfortunately, a small child died because of this. Multiple people had organ failure because of that outbreak. So this did change the rules and requirements for food safety in fast food restaurants, that they now have to cook meat to well done. They can cook it to medium rare if you opt, but they have to make it clear to you that this is not recommended and that you are initiating the desire to basically not cook your food to a safe temperature. Well, something to keep into consideration. So how can you get around this? It's hard to do, folks, but I would say the closest thing you possibly could do to protecting yourself is, number one, cooking things to well done. or two, buying a piece of meat that's highly attractive to you and have them grind it fresh, and then make sure that it is refrigerated at all times or cooked at all times. How do you do that? Well, when you go to the grocery store, you take cold packs. When you buy foods that have to be refrigerated, you put them in a cooler or in the cold packs in your car to transport home. The winters here are not below freezing, which means bacterial activity can become very active as you drive home. The longer the drive, the longer it takes you to unpack. The warmer your refrigerator, the greater opportunity for the bacteria to colonize. All right, other bacteria to take into consideration, Staphylococcus aureus. Folks, your whole body is coated in Staphylococcus aureus. This is our armor that helps protect us on the outside. But the catch is it never should go on the inside. This is why people with staph infections is because of an open wound that was not effectively cleaned and the staph on their skin migrated into the open wound. Or if you eat a piece of food and you get violently sick, vomiting and diarrhea, folks, that is typically Staphylococcus aureus. That can activate as fast as 4 hours or even sometimes an hour. How did you get that? Well, typically it would be that if, for example, a piece of hair from someone's head fell out and landed in the food with the bulb, the little root on the end on it, that root is from the skin of the hair, which is where the staph, one of the many places staph lives. And that would provide a feeding frenzy if there's protein in that food, i.e. meat, for the staph to reproduce. So golden rule number 1, if there's ever hair in your food, immediately check to see if there's a bulb attached to it. Otherwise, send it back if it's at a restaurant and say no go. If it's at home and it's your own hair, make sure there's no bulb on the end, the root. If there is, I don't care if it's your hair or anyone else's, you do not eat it. That being said, if there's a cockroach in your salad, he's protein. Okay, another bacteria to be concerned with is Clostridium botulinum. This is an anaerobic bacteria. It does not require oxygen to produce. Its byproduct, botulism, is a toxin. So think of it this way. If you ever have cans that are bulging at the ends, do not open them. They're bulging because of the pressure, the activity of the botulism. And if you were to puncture them, they would explode. And the potential of that toxin reaching your eye membranes could be very high, which means now you have direct exposure to botulism. Botulism, folks, arrests our lungs and our ability to breathe, which means that you would asphyxiate. So no, we don't want to have exposure to those. If the can is bursting, bulging at the ends, you tie it up in a bag, tie it up in another bag, and immediately take it to the garbage can. All right, there can be molds in our foods. Some are harmless, some are harmful. You have no idea which it is. Some people have allergic reactions to molds, whether it be blue cheese or anything else like on the bread. So the golden rule is you can cut it off of the food, but the problem is what is there and what the eye perceives are two different conversations. Usually we say you have to cut off anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches from the visual representation to eliminate all possible spores. There could be parasites in our food. Toxoplasma gondii is a great example. It comes from cat feces. We need to be cautious of that. You also want to think about things like hookworm that's in developing nations in the ground, in trichinosis that is going to be in pork in developing nations, or the possibility of worms in general. Oh my goodness, there's a whole variety of possibilities there, all of which are a little too exciting to go into detail, but I will give you one example of why we never want to eat street food in developing nations. Because if that food is not cooked to a high enough temperature to kill any parasites, worms included, what you eat is going to be is going to include them as a living creature. So I had a great family friend who went down to Central America and reveled in all the local food, eating street food. Came back to the United States, no harm, no foul. Life was really great. Um, but, many months later, Thanksgiving comes around and he hadn't been feeling very well and just always, feeling kind of lethargic, just feeling off. Everyone was saying that he was just always whiny and kind of becoming a drama king. So when he goes to Thanksgiving, again, they're eating and he doesn't feel well. He had been sick with the flu or something. He was feeling just, not great. So he excused himself, left the dinner. They ended up flying home, and he said that his energy was still really depleted and he just felt awful. And he got up one night and went to the bathroom. And it was a peculiar experience. So he turned on the light to observe. And what it was is an extremely large, long tapeworm that he had excreted from his body. Apparently, when he had the flu before Thanksgiving, the virus attacked. I can't exactly claim to understand what went on, but apparently his infection impacted the tapeworm also. And the tapeworm was experiencing its last dying hurrah, and then it passed out of him. So, yeah, that was a pretty succinct lesson for me that, street food got to be cooked all the way. Something to consider. All right, toxins. We never want to have cleaning solutions near our food because of the possibility of contamination. And then contaminants, folks, could include things like this could be glass shards, plastic pieces, metal chips. Periodically, it's very interesting. We will have food recalls, especially on foods where it could be mixed in, like sausages. And it could be because maybe there was construction going on in the same place the food was being processed. I had an incident where when I was pregnant, I was at a Thai restaurant up in Seattle and I was eating pad Thai and I pulled out one of those wire scrubby meshes that you use to clean pots and pans out of my pad Thai. Can you imagine? I was like, what the heck is this? It was literally buried in the bottom of my pad Thai. How could they not notice dishing it up? I do not know. But man, always pay attention to your food. For that reason, I will never do one of those little dining adventures in LA where you go into the room completely in a black, darkened room and you can't see your food. No, thank you. Always encourage you to be able to see your food. Okay, I provided for you guys a list of green pages. There are 3 total of probably the most frequently exposed microbes to human beings through our foods. And I strongly encourage you to keep this because it really helps you understand when you're sick how the medical community can treat you. First and foremost, what is most important is if you ever get sick, you've got to take a look at the onset symptoms. What are you experiencing? Is it abdominal pain? Is it fever? Is it bloody diarrhea? Because all of this will help you identify what kind of infection it is. Then what you're able to do is look at what the onset is. Is it 5 days? Is it 1 day? Is it 2 days? Is it 1 hour, like Staphylococcus aureus? And then you're able to kind of generalize all the possible foods so that 1, other people don't eat them, and 2, so that it can be destroyed right away. So this is just a really great resource. I strongly encourage you to keep for life. All right, dangerous symptoms of foodborne illnesses. Because it's an invasion of bacteria in the human body, our biggest concerns are really going to start with things like dehydration, imbalance of electrolytes that can impact the heart. Also, bloody diarrhea, loss of blood in the body, difficulty breathing or swallowing. Of all the cases of food poisoning, the greatest majority actually comes from seafood. Poor preparation and handling of seafood. If you eat sushi, it should always be sushi grade sushi, meaning how it was handled, how it was frozen on the fishing boats. Second to that is produce, and that's largely because a lot of our produce is consumed raw. Third is going to be poultry, and has a lot to do with the treatment of the animals and our vast consumption of chicken and eggs. And thirdly, beef, and really focusing on ground beef. These are examples of food safety recalls. These are a few years old. I'll get some new ones. But first of all, the very top one is you've got an example of metal pieces from construction that ended up inside of food products. Second one is an outbreak of listeria in cheese. And the third one is there was beef and pork products that had not been inspected, and without federal inspection crossing state lines, they cannot be consumed by the public and they have to be recalled. And the recalls are really important, folks. We had a few years ago, the stockyards here in California had, I think, over 1 million pounds of ground beef that had been issued to the LA Unified School District. And none of that beef had been inspected, yet it was being distributed to school children. So they had to issue a recall and destroy all of the beef because none of it had been inspected. So mistakes on people's parts can become incredibly costly. How do we manage the prevention of cross-contamination and infection from foodborne illnesses at home? Well, golden rule number 1, wash your hands. You touch meat, wash your hands before you touch other food products. You go to the bathroom, you wash your hands. You go outside and do something, you wash your hands, because that helps reduce the transference of bacteria and virus. Secondly, when preparing foods, always have one cutting board that's designated purely for meat. It's ideal to run it through the dishwasher. If not, you really want it to be exposed to scalding water, hot soap and water to cleanse it. That whenever you're preparing foods, using knives, mixing spoons or bowls, wash them with hot soapy water between use of each different type of food product, or even if you're carving a steak and then you're about to carve another one, it's wise to clean the board in between. You reduce the likelihood of people getting sick. When you prepare poultry, folks, you do not rinse it. Yeah, I'm serious. You don't rinse chicken off. You don't believe me? Well, do a fun little experiment. Get some tissue paper and line the sink, the counter around the sink. Now rinse the poultry off and then pick up the tissue paper and hold it up to the light, and you will see the microscopic droplets from the chicken all over the tissue paper. Folks, if that chicken had salmonella, it spread through the air onto the counter surface where you do not see it moving. Then you go, let's say, to the refrigerator and you get lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and you put them down on the counter after you're done rinsing the chicken. And any bacteria that's been loitering there, whether 5 minutes or 5 hours, has been colonizing in a warm temperature, and it'll now transfer to your salad products, which you prepare, put into a bowl, and leave out at room temperature, continuing to grow. You take the chicken, you cook the chicken, you achieve internal temperature, you kill off the bacteria, but the salmonella now is on the salad, and the salad is what will make you sick. So this is why we need to be very cautious about things like washing hands, different cutting boards, washing utensils between uses, and never rinsing our poultry. All right, we already talked about bulging cans. We do not open them because of the possibility of botulism. We double bag them and dispose of them. That when we cook meats, we want to cook to an internal temperature that is safe. When we are done cooking them, we want to cool them quickly, not to store foods in big containers in the refrigerator, but actually to store foods in smaller containers that can cool down more quickly, less than 2 hours before we put them in the refrigerator. Why do we need to cool foods quickly before we put them in the fridge? Because if we put them in hot, they will elevate the temperature in the refrigerator, which will then bring all the other bacteria in the fridge to life and allow it to further colonize on the foods. This is a great little just handy dandy thermometer to remind you of the safe cooking temperatures. So the general rule of thumb is for things like steaks, it's 145 degrees internal temperature. But then if we're talking about ground meats like ground beef, it needs to go up to 160 degrees. For poultry, our target zone is somewhere between 165 and 170. Yes, we have a higher temperature for poultry, chicken, and turkey because of that possibility of salmonella. All right, safety for produce. Folks, it's very easy. You can wash basic foods like apples, bananas, and avocados because you peel them. It's not necessarily a concern, but it's always prudent to rinse them off. Same goes with your melons. But you have to take into consideration that when you cut through a food like a melon, if the surface has bacteria, the knife will carry the bacteria through the flesh and you'll experience greater exposure to it. We have had outbreaks of salmonella and listeria on things like cantaloupe, tomatoes, and nuts. So all things to take into consideration. Reducing pesticides, like reducing the likelihood of bacteria, you can utilize simple washes on your fruits and vegetables, those which don't have a lot of tiny little spaces like broccoli, of course. So we're talking more about bigger food products like tomatoes, apples, with smooth surfaces. And I think probably, honestly, you can purchase the more expensive fruit washes, or I would just go to Target and buy Dr. Bronner's biodegradable peppermint soap, or they have one that has no scent to it at all or flavor, and use that to clean your produce. It just takes a few drops in some warm water to gently massage the surface and then rinse it off effectively. But peeling, yes, that's an option, folks, but just keep in mind that it is better to wash it than to peel it because a lot of the nutrition is on the skin of the food product, and including the fiber. Now, food dates. Food dates on packaging of foods is optional. Optional meaning by the industry. It doesn't mean that they have to include food dates. The idea of sell-by doesn't mean that food is going to explode past its date. It's just a recommendation that they can guarantee the quality through that date. But is the food always good before the sell-by date? No. Sometimes it's already gone bad. I mean, I've bought milk that's supposed to be good for another week and it's already sour. I've also bought milk that was good for a couple weeks after. Folks, it really depends on how it was transferred and stored. Best if used by, that date actually protects food companies so that if you open up a bag of Doritos after the date and it's rancid, that's not their problem, that's your problem. But if you were to open that bag of Doritos before the best if used by date, then they would out of good business practice, they would honor it by sending you a rebate to get another bag for free. Expiration date, folks, you know, there really is no such thing as things expiring. It's either good or it's not. Eggs do have an expiration date just because of the aging process. Man, when those puppies go bad, they are bad. But the reality is that you can keep them in their container for several days. Open dating, that might be that they put a date on when it was prepared, processed, packaged. Um, those are just dates, control dates for them to know what lots it's coming from, when it was prepared. The bottom line is, folks, is, there are some foods, like when you cook foods, you really don't want to leave it longer than 2 to 3 days in the refrigerator to reduce the likelihood of growing bacteria. Uh, you want to take into consideration other foods like kefir and yogurt. When they're sealed and have never been opened, they've been inoculated with good bacteria, which means you don't have bad bacteria growing in them. The good bacteria will continue to feed off of it, breaking the lactose bonds. No harm, no foul. My yogurt from the expo one year, really fantastic, yogurt, real simple, plain, had good bacteria in it. Pulled it out of the fridge, ate it. I couldn't figure out why it tasted so much like butter until I turned around and realized the quote unquote expiry date or sell by date was 2 years prior. So did it make me sick? No, because it was rich in healthy bacteria. It just had changed texture because the bacteria had been digesting all of the sugar bonds. All right. Managing food safety in commercial environments. First of all, facilities will always have sanitation and sanitary handling guides. They will have training for the employees. They'll have to utilize things oftentimes like similar to lab coats or aprons, hair nets, beard nets. Usually in really good, responsible commercial kitchens, the employees will not be allowed to wear rings, jewelry, or painted nails or artificial nails. Pasteurization is a way for us to be able to elevate very quickly at a high heat things like your cow's milk to eliminate any bacteria, and then they reduce the heat quickly, not to damage the nutrients in it. Irradiation is used for things like juice boxes and spices to eliminate any bacteria or pests that are in those. Modified atmosphere packaging, folks, is utilizing things like carbon dioxide plus nitrogen in the packaging rather than oxygen to eliminate an air source for bacteria. Washing of foods, especially, for example, the eggs regarding salmonella. And refrigeration and freezers to ensure that the temperatures are appropriate to the foods. Storage and packaging, again, appropriate, whether it be cryovac or saran wrapped or in a tray. With effective messaging on the packaging, storage, utilizing things in the business, first in, first out, never storing food directly on the floor. All of these are ways that we're able to help prevent the likelihood of foodborne pathogens. When we talk about the food industry and the commercial care of cows, pigs, chickens, oftentimes they will give them antibiotics to help prevent the development of diseases because of their close proximity. They're not allowed to live the way they naturally do. Folks, animals are social beings, but they are not designed to be crowded together in tenement housing style on top of each other. And it's very unfortunate because part of that means that they pass diseases from one to the other very effectively. Because of our overuse of antibiotics in animals, we think this is what's given rise to MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Our own staph that has become so powerful we cannot control it with antibiotics. Other things to take into consideration as contamination would be bioaccumulation. This is going to be things coming from our industry, runoffs, mercury being a great example out in our ocean and our fish. The closer the fish are to the surface that feed closer to the shore, they're going to have a higher mercury content than the fish that are going to be deeper in the ocean or farther out to sea. PCBs. This is polychlorinated biphenyls. These are predicted to promote cancer, induce nervous system damage, immune dysfunction, and they come from our plastics. All right, pesticides, those are neurotoxins designed to kill insects. Well, insects are living creatures with nervous systems, as are we. That's a concern. And contamination from chemicals like cleaning agents, oil runoff from our cars into the ocean, and then, of course, as we discussed, objects. This could be, for example, the microplastic beads that are coming from facial care lines that are washing into our ocean and getting embedded in our birds and our fish. It's horrific what we do because we do things for our own pleasure, but we don't take into consideration always the impact that it has on all life, not just humans. All right, there are some absolutely fantastic resources that I provided for food safety. The first one is from the USDA. The second one is another recommendation for food safety from the feds. The third bullet is actually from Australia, and it's just a really great, right, isn't it? That should be it. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, the lecture, hard copy lecture that you have in your files, folks, will have all 4 actually links for you to refer to. But we're going to give it a shot right now and see if we can watch about an outbreak of Bluebell ice cream and how it impacted a variety of people over a period of time.
Tonight, we've learned that deaths linked to ice cream tainted with bacteria were part of an outbreak that had actually been going on for years. In April, Bluebell Creameries recalled products from 23 states because of listeria, which can be fatal to those with weak immune systems. In part 2 of our investigation, Jim Axelrod shows us how the case of the mystery deaths was solved.
When Megan Davis and her team from the South Carolina Department of Health randomly sampled 10 products from a local Bluebell distribution center in January, the last thing they expected to find was listeria.
It was unbelievable, actually. We never in a million years thought we would find a positive sample.
2 of the 10 samples tested positive. But just to be sure, they went back and collected 30 more.
And all 30 of the samples that we tested positive for listeria.
Stunning.
Yeah, stunning. A little scary that those products were going to consumers.
Davis uploaded their findings into PulseNet, a database of DNA fingerprints the Centers for Disease Control monitors to identify outbreaks nationwide.
A group that matched.
Dr. Robert Taux is deputy director of the CDC's Foodborne Disease Division.
The listeria germs found in South Carolina in the ice cream matched illnesses in a hospital in Kansas.
That hospital was Via Christi St. Francis in Wichita. Listeria had sickened 5 of their patients over the past year, but the hospital couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The listeria patterns found in South Carolina solved the mystery in Kansas. It turns out all 5 of the patients had been served milkshakes made with Bluebell ice cream. In mid-February, Bluebell quietly pulled all the ice cream made on the machine that had produced the ice cream testing positive in South Carolina, citing a quality issue. But Via Christi still had plenty of other Bluebell products in its freezers. The Kansas Department of Health tested 45 of them and found another hit.
When that was loaded up into the PulseNet database, it matched 5 other patients. But these weren't recent.
These 5 cases came from 3 different states, going back to 2010.
Unknown and unappreciated to anyone, a low-level outbreak was going on 4 or 5 years.
An outbreak no one was looking for, that very nearly went undetected.
Our inspector could have picked 2 different ice cream products to test. What if he hadn't picked those 2 samples? It may have had a different outcome.
PulseNet enabled the CDC to trace the tainted ice cream not just to Bluebell's main plant in Brenham, Texas, but to another Bluebell factory in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma as well. Bluebell has said it is increasing its focus on sanitation and cleaning and is being evaluated by independent microbiologists. In a statement to CBS News today, Bluebell said, quote, "Our top priority and commitment is to produce high quality, safe, delicious ice cream for our customers."
Fascinating detective story in part 3 tomorrow. Jim, thanks very much.
Now, what was disturbing about that case, folks, regarding Bluebell is that employees were interviewed about the facility, and what came out is that apparently they were reusing cardboard boxes that had a lot of melted ice cream on them. That's a feeding frenzy for bacteria. They were packing food and storing it on the ground directly.
Fear raises your cortisol levels more than any.
What's disturbing is that they started interviewing employees who had been at that facility, at the facilities, and they said that a lot of disturbing things. One, that they were reusing cardboard boxes to pack the ice creams that already had melted ice cream in them from prior shipments. And that's a feeding frenzy for bacteria when it's in warm temperatures. Also, they were packing the ice cream directly on the ground, coming in contact with the floor rather than using pallets. They also said that the facility had holes in the ceiling, and when it rained, the water would drip and run down the walls of the factory. So a lot of disturbing things to take into consideration, which is why it is so important that we inspect our food supply chains to make sure that they meet safety standards and that they follow general protocols. And what does that boil down to? Health inspectors. And unfortunately, I will tell you that they are typically the first to get the budget cut in our nation. So sad. Okay, that's it for the food safety section. Hopefully you've gained some nuggets of wisdom on how to practice food safety for yourselves.